So Lorraine Johnson is the author and/or editor of 15 books, many of which address environmental issues with a particular focus on native plant habitat protection and cultivation, urban agriculture, and the intersections of land care and justice. Some of her current projects include presenting her talk, Unsettling the Garden, How Native Plants Connect with Reconciliation and Healing the Land, a non-Indigenous perspective, advocating for the revision of property standards to bylaws that too often penalize the efforts of urban gardeners to support native life, and co-authoring with Dr. Sheila Kola, A Flower Patch for the Rusty Patch Bumblebee, a guide for establishing a native bee-friendly garden, which you can download for free at the link in Lorraine's bio on the Soul website. So, Lorraine, if you want to go ahead.
Thank you. Now, is my screen showing and can everyone hear me?
Yes, it's all set.
Great, thanks a lot. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm joining this digital space, this online space from Toronto, the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit. And uh, I always want to make a commitment through land acknowledgements. And so I want to publicly express my commitment to land back. Um, so today or this evening, I'm going to be talking about some of the histories and origins and connections around common cultural narratives that reinforce landscape conventions. And I'm going to go through uh, my slides very quickly, but I'm looking forward to conversation after the presentations. And these are obviously a very selective view of these conventions, and it's maybe a very idiosyncratic selection. So I think the first and one of the most obvious is the common cultural narrative that monocultural manicured lawn is kind of the proper response to human habitat. And of course, there's a colonial history of the lawn. It's a privileged landscape from Britain and Europe that took so much labor to maintain, and then it was imported to North America, and it was eventually popularized and democratized so that it was much more accessible. But that's been accompanied with a very coercive aspect to the lawn, in that now that it's the, quote unquote standard, any deviation from it is possibly punished, and punished with different levels of severity, right up to court cases such as Sandy Bell's or Doug Counters. So it's a common cultural narrative that doesn't just reinforce the landscape conventions, but it's also can be enforced legally through things like municipal grass and weeds bylaws. Another common cultural narrative is that of erasure. Gardening, like, it's a land-based activity that rarely engages with questions about whose land, and even what that question means and where it leads. Another common cultural narrative is one that privileges quote unquote exotic plants from elsewhere, regardless of what the ecological costs of that might be, so that we're now at a point where those plants are also a kind of erasure within the landscape of the indigenous plants and the native plants that would have been that have been evolving here for millennia. Another common cultural narrative is that the harder something is to grow, the more value and status it confers onto the garden and to the gardener. This is a very common thread that you see throughout the gardening media and elsewhere. And I think related to that narrative is one that I would say is kind of an older narrative. I wouldn't say it's as strong right now, but certainly, wow, it was so common a few decades ago. It's so jarring to look in old gardening magazines, for example, and just especially the ads, and they are all about gardening as a battle. And gardening, and that means, of course, that the gardener's then the triumphant one over the conditions in the garden. So it's kind of gardening as triumphalism, very strong narrative. A common cultural narrative that quote unquote weeds or any kind of unmanaged growth is bad, and again has to be avoided whatever the costs. I do think that this narrative is being a little bit complicated now within, you know, the kind of narrative and discussion of gardens by climate change um, and which is and actually and also by so-called invasive species, which are the kind of unintended or unacknowledged or undealt with consequences of, in fact, the horticultural industry and the gardening public that is privileging this global movement of plants and the plants from elsewhere in the garden. Another common cultural narrative, very strong, is that gardens should be quote unquote tidy, not messy, although there's definitely a thread that messiness will be tolerated as long as there's lots of color, and lots of color in the garden, like throughout the whole growing season. There's a lack of acknowledgement of sort of change and the dynamism of plants. Common cultural narrative that new and commercially manipulated plants, so the cultivars, the hybrids that are propagated clonally, and therefore are quite predictable in the way they express. There's a narrative that these are better for gardens. Yeah, better. And this, I think, is also wrapped up in notions of progress, but progress is defined by and for commercial and industrial purposes. Like the improvements are designed to conform to human ideas, human perceived needs. I think there's also a common cultural narrative, and certainly within the industry, like within you know, landscape architecture or anything kind of design related, that plants are materials. That's what many professions call plants, actually, materials. And that if they have agency, it's an agency that must be controlled. And in this narrative in particular, I find there's this very strange and hard to figure out conflation and inconsistency and this confused message about the whole idea of like super fecund plants, like that end up being called aggressive in the gardening media or in gardening kind of dominant narratives, and they're rejected because of their aggressiveness, often quite vehemently, instead of that fecundity and their willingness to spread, instead of that being considered an incredibly generous gift from the plants. And it's confused me for a long time because, like, as gardeners, aren't we interested in growth and, you know, that generosity of growth? A common cultural narrative that all insects are a threat, even a foe, and the idea of kill first, identify later, if at all. The common cultural narrative that experts know best, and that expertise is based solely on Western science and excludes traditional ecological knowledge. Another very common cultural narrative that there are these aesthetic rules that are universal and that represent good design. This is from an article in the Washington Post just the other day. You know, ecological gardens are all the rage, but they need to be pleasing to the eye. But what's never talked about is who defines what's pleasing to the eye? Is there such a thing as universally pleasing to the eye? What is that assumption about? This another common theme or actually, sorry, all of what I see as some common themes in these common cultural narratives is that many of them have to do with dominance, control, exoticism, consumerism, acquisitiveness, extractiveness, human exceptionalism, short-term thinking, non-holistic thinking. But I do find something hopeful in that I think in some ways things have been changing certainly in the last few decades, not nearly enough, but certainly somewhat. And I think that some of the principles for further change, because I do think it's possible to harness the gardening impulse in order to create positive change, and some possible principles for that change that I hope we can talk about further: biodiversity, reciprocity in relationship, agency, place, not property, acknowledging, accepting, celebrating change, decay, death, cycles in the land of the land and of plants, seeing function as beauty, um, connecting to the world, not separateness. There's such a dominant narrative from the very beginning of the very origins of gardening as a closed off and separate retreat from the world. But I think we need to connect our gardens to the world and actually kind of consider our activity of gardening as a conversation that includes deep listening, a conversation with the planet. So for me, what I would like to see is that we ask a different kind of question of our gardens and of ourselves as gardeners. And that question for me is really about what are the seeds of opportunity that we intend to grow when we plant, nourish, nurture, and cultivate gardens. So, thanks. And I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, that was lovely. I recognized a few pieces in there. That Washington Post article was a subject of discussion today in the Master Gardeners page. And so yes, there was some good conversation around there.